I have replayed those 12 minutes so many times that I could draw you a map of every single second. 12 minutes. That was all it took for 17 years of marriage to split open like a seam that had been quietly fraying long before I have ever noticed the lock. I didn't know it yet, standing in the lumber aisle of Whitmore Hardware with a paint swatch in my hand. I thought I was just picking out a color for the guest bedroom. I didn't know a woman named Rosa was about to hand me the truth I hadn't even known I was missing. It started like any other Sunday. Marcus and I had a rhythm we'd fallen into years ago, back when we were still renting that tiny apartment on Meridian Street and dreaming about the house we'd someday build together. Coffee on the porch first, then the farmer's market if the weather held, then the hardware store run. Always the hardware store. Whitmore Hardware was the kind of place that still had wooden floors that creaked, and employees who actually knew where things were, the kind of place my grandfather would have loved. He'd been a landscape architect for 40 years, the man who taught me the difference between soil that would hold a garden and soil that would slowly starve it. He'd been gone for almost a decade now, but every time I walked into Whitmore's, I still thought of him. Marcus and I had been married 17 years that spring. 17 years of shared mortgage payments and shared vacations, and shared decisions about which schools to send the kids to. Though the kids never came, a grief I'd carried quietly for years, while Marcus told me it was fine, that we had each other, that we didn't need anything else. I'd believed him. I'd built a whole life around believing him. That morning, he'd worn his brown canvas jacket, the one with the torn pocket he refused to let me mend because he said it gave it character. He'd kissed my temple in the paint aisle the way he always did, absent-minded and familiar, a gesture so automatic I'd stopped registering it as affection and started registering it simply as habit. We filled the cart with the things we always bought. Brass screws for a cabinet hinge he'd been meaning to fix, a new filter for the HVAC system, a bag of potting soil for the raised beds I'd been planning since spring. Normal things, ordinary things. The kind of Sunday you forget the moment it's over. We got to the checkout line around 2 o'clock. I remember because the store was starting to empty out, the after-church crowd gone home to their lunches and their naps. Only a few other customers shuffling through the aisles, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of sawdust and fertilizer hanging in the air like it always did. Marcus touched my elbow and leaned in. Wait in the car for me, okay? I want to grab one more thing. 12 minutes, tops. There's a specific bracket I need for the workshop. They keep it in the back. I nodded. This wasn't unusual. Marcus was an architect with his own firm, and he was always in the middle of some project or another, always needing some specific piece of hardware that couldn't be found in the regular aisles. The workshop in our backyard had been his domain for as long as we'd owned the house, a place I rarely entered because he said the clutter made him productive, and I'd learned years ago not to argue with the way he organized his space. Take your time, I said. I'll start loading. He smiled at me, that same easy smile that had made me fall for him at a mutual friend's dinner party when I was 32, and worried I'd missed my chance at the kind of love that lasts. Then he turned and walked toward the back of the store, his canvas jacket disappearing around the corner near the contractor's desk. I finished paying. I loaded the bags into the cart. I stood near the exit doors with my phone in my hand, scanning for messages, waiting. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I checked my phone again. No text, no call. I felt the first small prickle of unease, the kind you talk yourself out of because it seems absurd. He probably ran into someone he knew. He probably got talking to a manager about a special order. He probably lost track of time in the fastener aisle, the way he always did. 12 minutes in, I decided to go look for him. That was when Rosa found me. She was maybe 63. Silver hair pulled back in a neat braid, wearing the store's red vest with a name tag that said Rosa, 19 years. I'd seen her before, working the garden center, always patient with customers who didn't know a perennial from an annual, always willing to help me carry the heavy bags of compost to my car. She approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read at the time. Not urgency exactly, something more careful than that, something that looked like she'd been deciding whether to speak up for longer than I wanted to think about. Mrs. Donovan, she said quietly, glancing past me toward the registers like she didn't want anyone else to hear. I think you should come with me. I laughed a little, confused. Is something wrong with my card? I thought the payment went through. She didn't answer that. She just gestured toward a hallway near the garden center exit, a door marked Employees Only, and something in her face made the laugh die in my throat. I followed her. My cart was still next to the registers. I remember that detail specifically, how absurd it felt to abandon a cart full of potting soil and brass screws to follow a woman I barely knew into a back hallway of a hardware store. As if my life were about to become something that happened in employee-only corridors, instead of the ordinary aisles where ordinary people bought ordinary things. The security office was small and cramped, a wall of monitors flickering with black and white footage from different corners of the store. Rosa sat down at the desk and pulled up a recording, her fingers moving across the keyboard, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, who had shown footage to people before, who knew that some conversations required evidence before words could follow. She didn't explain right away. She just pressed play. And there was Marcus, not in the back aisle looking for a bracket for his workshop. He was in the contractor's loading area near the lumber yard, standing close to a woman I didn't recognize. Tall, auburn hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, maybe late 40s, wearing a blazer that looked expensive and entirely out of place in a hardware store on a Sunday afternoon. They weren't touching. There was nothing explicitly incriminating in the footage, nothing I could point to and name as proof of anything specific. But there was an ease in the way they stood together, the way her hand gestured toward a stack of building supplies on a pallet, the way he nodded along to whatever she was saying, like they'd had this conversation 100 times before. The way they loaded bags of concrete mix and bundles of cedar shingles onto a flat cart together, working in the synchronized rhythm of two people who had done this many, many times. "This isn't the first time," Rosa said, not unkindly. "I've seen him back there with her maybe 6, 7 times over the past few months. Different days, different times, always loading materials, always together." She paused, and something in her face shifted, something personal. "My husband passed 6 years ago. Cancer. And I always wished somebody had told me things sooner. Not about him, he was a good man. But about other things, about the world, about how sometimes you need someone to say what they've seen even when it's not their place." She shrugged, a small gesture that looked like it cost her something. "Figured you'd want to know." I thanked her. I don't remember exactly what I said. Something polite, something automatic, the kind of response your mouth produces when your mind hasn't caught up to what your eyes just witnessed. I walked back out through the store, past the garden center, past the paint swatches, past the cart I'd abandoned near the registers. I walked out into the parking lot where the autumn sun was bleaching everything pale gold, and there was Marcus leaning against our silver Outback with his phone in his pocket, smiling like nothing in the world was wrong. "Sorry that took forever," he said. "They couldn't find the bracket in the back. Had to special order it." He opened the passenger door for me, a gentlemanly gesture he'd been doing since our first date. "Ready to go home?" I smiled back. I said absolutely nothing. The drive home was quiet in the way it always was. Marcus talked about a client's renovation project. Something about load-bearing walls and historical preservation requirements, and I nodded at the right moments. Nothing about my face gave anything away. 17 years of marriage, and it turned out I was better at hiding things than I ever imagined. Or maybe I just needed time. Time to understand what I'd actually seen. Time to decide what I was going to do with it. That night after dinner, after our usual routine of dishes and news and reading in bed, I noticed something I had never once seen in 17 years together. Marcus reached over, turned his phone face down, and slid it beneath his pillow before he fell asleep. I lay there in the dark beside him for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to him breathe. I didn't confront him. I want to be honest about that, because I know some women would have. Some women would have shaken him awake that very night and demanded answers, thrown accusations across the bedroom, like knives. That has never been who I am. My grandfather didn't raise me to react. He raised me to observe, to understand the whole landscape before I planted anything. Soil first, he used to say. You have to know what you're working with before you can grow anything worth keeping. So I decided to wait, to watch, to learn. The next morning, I bought a small leather journal from a stationery shop downtown, the kind with unlined pages and a ribbon bookmark, and I started writing things down. It felt strange at first, almost like I was betraying him just by paying attention. But I told myself I was simply gathering facts the way Marcus himself had taught me to when we argued about budgets early in our marriage. Don't react emotionally, he used to say. Look at the numbers, look at the pattern. So that's what I did. I looked for the pattern dates, times, the excuses he gave for being late or unreachable. I wrote them all down in that leather journal tucked inside my nightstand drawer beneath a stack of old garden catalogs. Every client meeting that ran long. Every phone call he took in the workshop with the door closed. Every Wednesday afternoon he came home smelling faintly of fresh lumber and coffee from a cafe I didn't recognize, claiming it was a site visit that had run into the evening. Within 10 days, the pattern became undeniable. Every Wednesday without fail, every other Friday, like clockwork. Always tied to some vague project name I could never quite pin down. The Morrison remodel, the Clearwater site inspection, a development called Bridgewater Commons I'd never heard him mention before. That month, I began to realize that these weren't spontaneous excuses. They were scheduled, practiced. A man doesn't accidentally develop a recurring pattern of disappearances unless he's protecting something on purpose. One Wednesday, I told Marcus I had a landscape consultation of my own. A lie, my first real lie to him in 17 years, and it came out of my mouth so easily, it scared me. Instead, I drove to the small commercial strip off Route 12, the one he'd mentioned in passing as the location of his Bridgewater Commons meeting. I parked across the street in the shadow of a closed laundromat, and I waited, Marcus arrived first, right on time, dressed in his navy blazer, the one he wore for what he called important client presentations. He went inside a coffee shop, the Roasted Bean, the kind of place with industrial lighting and pour-over coffee that cost $7 a cup. 20 minutes later, a woman arrived. I recognized her instantly from the security footage. Auburn hair, sleek ponytail, same expensive blazer or one very much like it. She walked in alone, ordered at the counter alone, sat down across from him like this was routine, like they'd done this so many times that the choreography no longer required conscious thought. I watched them through the window for almost an hour. What struck me most wasn't affection. There was no lingering touch, no stolen kiss, nothing that screamed romance the way I had almost expected, almost hoped for in some strange way, because at least an affair would have been simple. An affair would have been a wound I could name. What I saw instead was something quieter and somehow more unsettling. Papers passed between them. Blueprints, I realized, squinting through the coffee shop window. Architectural drawings spread across the table. Marcus pointing to something on a page while she nodded, her expression serious, focused, businesslike. A manila folder changing hands. They didn't arrive together. They didn't leave together. She left first, walking briskly to a silver BMW parked 2 blocks down. He left 12 minutes after, checking his phone, adjusting his blazer, driving home like nothing unusual had happened at all. That night, I lay awake again, turning it over. This isn't an affair, I thought. Or if it is, it's wrapped around something else entirely. Something with blueprints and manila folders and construction materials loaded onto flat carts in hardware store loading docks. Meanwhile, Marcus himself seemed to be changing in small ways. I doubt anyone but a wife of 17 years would have caught. His phone, which used to sit carelessly on the kitchen counter while he showered, now went with him everywhere, even to the bathroom, even to walk the dog. He changed his passcode 3 times in 2 weeks, and when I asked him about it casually, he mumbled something about work security protocols and changed the subject fast. He started taking evening walks alone, phone pressed to his ear, voice low. And when I asked who he was talking to, he'd say, "Just a client," in a tone that used to be light and was now, if I listened closely, just slightly too quick. I never followed him on those walks. I told myself it wasn't the moment yet. I wasn't ready to know everything. And some instinct in me, the same instinct that had kept our marriage steady for 17 years, the instinct for patience my grandfather had drilled into me in every garden we'd ever planted together, told me that if I pushed too soon, Marcus would simply get better at hiding, and I needed him careless a little while longer. So I watched, I documented. I filled that leather journal with dates and times and small inconsistencies that were beginning to form a shape I didn't yet understand, but which I knew somewhere deep in my chest was far bigger than a woman in a blazer at a coffee shop. Then on a rainy Saturday afternoon, while Marcus was out at what he called a site consultation, I sat down at the kitchen table to organize old tax documents, something I did every year around that time, a habit as routine as our Sunday hardware store runs. I pulled out folders going back 7 years, sorting through W-2s and receipts and old bank statements, my mind only half on the task. That's when I found the receipts. They were tucked inside a folder marked Workshop Expenses 2022, half buried beneath old invoices for lumber and hardware supplies. But these weren't for the workshop. They were for a property I had never heard of, a address on Ridgeview Road, about an hour north of where we lived. Invoices for foundation work, for framing, for electrical rough-in, for custom windows, for cedar shingles, the same kind I'd seen them loading onto a flat cart in the security footage. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time just staring at the address on those receipts, as if staring hard enough might make it explain itself. 17 years of marriage, and I thought I knew every project Marcus was working on, every property his firm had touched. This one wasn't firm business. This one wasn't in any client file I'd ever seen. This one was hidden in a folder marked Workshop Expenses, like something meant to be overlooked by anyone who wasn't looking for it. I didn't say anything to him. By that point, silence had become its own kind of skill, something I was getting uncomfortably good at. Instead, the following Monday, I called Elena Vasquez. I'd met Elena years earlier through a women's business network, back when she'd helped a friend of mine navigate a complicated partnership dissolution. I remembered her as sharp, unflinching, the kind of woman who didn't waste time on comfort when facts were what mattered. I called her office and told her I needed a consultation. When she asked what regarding, I said simply, "I think my husband is building something I don't know about. I don't know what yet, but I think I need a lawyer." We met 2 days later in her office downtown, all clean lines and abstract art and a window that looked out over the river. I laid out what I had, the leather journal, the photographs I'd quietly taken of Marcus and the woman outside the Roasted Bean, and the receipts from the folder marked Workshop Expenses. Alina listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad. And when I finished, she set the pen down and looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy. It was something more useful than that. Focus. Before you say a single word to him, she said, we need to understand what we're dealing with financially. Confrontation without information is how people lose everything. Let's look at the money first. Let's look at the property. Let's understand the whole structure before we move a single piece of it. That was the beginning of weeks I can only describe as strange, quiet, methodical. Elena brought in a forensic accountant named James Okonkwo, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had the patience of someone who'd spent a career untangling other people's secrets. He asked me for access to every financial document I could gather. Statements, tax filings, business records, anything with our names on it and anything without. At first, everything looked ordinary. Marcus had always managed our finances closely. It was his profession, after all, or adjacent to it, and I'd never had reason to question the numbers he showed me every year at tax time. Our joint accounts looked healthy. Our mortgage was on schedule. Nothing jumped out. Then James found the property. The Ridgeview Road address was owned by a limited liability company called Crescent Build Partners, registered 3 years earlier to a woman named Victoria Hale. The same woman from the security footage. The same woman from the roasted bean. And the property wasn't just a vacant lot or a small cabin. It was a 5-acre parcel with a large structure under construction. A structure that, according to the building permits James pulled, was zoned for commercial use. A boutique hotel, the permit said. 12 rooms, a restaurant space. A spa addition planned for phase 2. It gets more interesting, James said, sliding a spreadsheet across the table. The construction costs for this property, based on the invoices I've been able to trace, total somewhere in the range of $800,000 over the past 3 years. But Crescent Build Partners doesn't have any revenue. It doesn't have any clients. It doesn't have any income stream that I can identify. What it has is regular capital infusions from a separate account. He paused, checking his notes. An account in your husband's name, not joint. Separate. One you're not listed on. I remember the number landing somewhere in my chest like a stone dropped into water. $800,000. Money that had come from accounts I believed were simply funding Marcus's architecture practice, his legitimate projects, the ordinary costs of running a firm. Instead, it had been quietly funneled month after month into a boutique hotel, being built by a woman I'd never met on a property I'd never heard of. Elena leaned forward, her voice measured but serious. Claire, I want to be honest with you. People don't build secret hotels with secret business partners unless they're planning for a future that doesn't include their spouse. This isn't a midlife crisis. This isn't an affair that got out of hand. This is a systematic diversion of marital assets into a business venture designed to generate revenue that you would have no claim to, no knowledge of, and no way to trace once the construction was complete and the money started coming back in. I sat with that for a long moment. My mind went back to the coffee shop, to the blueprints spread across the table, to the careful, practiced way they'd avoided arriving or leaving together. I had assumed, foolishly maybe, that whatever connected them was emotional. An affair, even a long one, even a serious one, was something I could have eventually made sense of. Painful, yes, but understandable in the way that human weakness is understandable. This was different. This felt engineered. Is she just his business partner? I asked slowly, testing the words as I spoke them. Or is there more? James and Elena exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. That's what we're going to find out, Elena said. James, can you pull more records on Crescent Build Partners? And Victoria Hale? It took James 4 more days. Corporate filings in our state were layered, especially for LLCs that had been set up through registered agents specifically to obscure ownership. But James was patient and thorough, and on a Thursday evening, fittingly one of the days that had become part of Marcus's regular pattern of disappearances, my phone rang. I found more, James said. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who had delivered difficult news before and knew there was no gentle way to do it. Victoria Hale isn't just a business partner. She's listed as Marcus's co-owner on 2 other properties I traced. One is a condo downtown purchased 4 years ago. The other is a vacation rental in the mountains, purchased 2 years ago. Both were acquired through separate LLCs with different names, but the ownership traces back to the same 2 people every time. Marcus Donovan and Victoria Hale. He paused. I'm sending you the documents now. I opened the files with my hands not quite steady. Property records, ownership filings, a paper trail that stretched back years, long before I'd ever stood in a hardware store's security office, watching black and white footage of my husband loading cedar shingles onto a flat cart with a woman I'd never seen before, Victoria Hale. I said the name out loud once, alone in my car in the parking garage after leaving Elena's office, just to see how it felt in my mouth. It felt like nothing. A stranger's name, ordinary and unremarkable, attached to a woman who had apparently been quietly building an entire second life with my husband for years without my knowledge. I started researching her the way I imagine most people do when they discover a stranger has become central to their marriage. Carefully. Obsessively. Late at night with a cup of tea going cold beside my laptop while Marcus slept upstairs unaware, Victoria's online presence was polished, professional. exactly what you'd expect from someone who wanted to project competence and success. Her LinkedIn described her as a hospitality development consultant, specializing in boutique properties and experiential travel. Her profile photo showed her in the same style of blazer I'd seen at the Roasted Bean, smiling the confident, practiced smile of someone used to being taken seriously in rooms full of investors. But Elena went further than a LinkedIn scroll. She had a paralegal pull public court records, and what surfaced painted a different picture than the one Victoria had built online. 2 civil judgments from nearly a decade earlier, one from a former development partner alleging breach of fiduciary duty, another from a contractor who claimed he'd never been paid for work on a property Victoria had helped manage. Both cases had ended in settlements, quiet and undisclosed, the kind of resolution that makes a problem disappear from public conversation without ever admitting fault. Nothing criminal, Elena clarified when she showed me the filings. Nothing that would hold up as fraud on its own. But it's a pattern. Failed partnerships. People left holding the bag. And now a hospitality development company funded quietly by your husband, building a hotel on land you didn't know existed using money from accounts you didn't know he had. I didn't say much in response. I was starting to understand that patterns were the whole story here. Not one dramatic betrayal, but years of small, careful movements, each one unremarkable on its own, each one part of something much larger when you finally saw them together. At home, Marcus had grown almost unnervingly relaxed. It was strange watching him during those weeks, knowing what I now knew, and seeing how little it seemed to weigh on him. If anything, he seemed lighter, more confident. One evening over dinner, out of nowhere, he mentioned the future. "I've been thinking," he said, cutting into his pasta like the conversation was the most casual thing in the world. "Maybe we should think about a change of pace in a few years. The firm is doing well. Really well, actually. I've been looking at some investment properties up north. Vacation rentals, that kind of thing. Could be a good income stream down the line. Something to think about when we're ready to slow down." He smiled at me over his wine glass, warm and easy, the same smile I'd fallen in love with 17 years earlier at a dinner party when I was 32, and afraid I'd missed my chance at the kind of love that lasts. "That sounds interesting," I said, keeping my voice light. "We're up north. Still scouting locations," he said smoothly. "Nothing concrete yet. Just thinking about the future. Our future. Our future." The words sat in my mouth like something I couldn't quite swallow. He wasn't describing a future he was building with me. He was describing the future he was already building with someone else, testing the waters to see if I'd noticed the shape of it, laying groundwork for a conversation that would eventually reveal the hotel and the condo and the vacation rental as new investments, rather than the years-old secrets they actually were. I smiled. I said it sounded wonderful. I told him I was excited to hear more when he had concrete plans, 17 years of marriage, and it turned out I was a very good liar when I needed to be. I could have confronted him right there at the dinner table. Some nights I lay awake rehearsing exactly what I would say, the words arranging themselves in my head like a script I never delivered. But Elena had been clear from our very first meeting. Confrontation without protection was how women lost everything. I needed to be positioned before I ever let him know I understood what he was doing. So instead of anger, I chose preparation. Over the following 2 weeks, I worked quietly with Elena to secure my own financial footing, moving with the same careful precision Marcus himself had apparently used to build his hidden structure. We reviewed the deed to our house, confirming it was jointly titled, which offered some protection but not enough on its own. We documented every joint account, every investment, every asset acquired during our marriage, building a paper trail that would matter enormously if this ever became the legal battle I suspected it eventually would. I opened a separate account in my name alone, modest at first, moving small amounts from my landscape design earnings. Nothing dramatic enough to raise flags. Nothing that would tip Marcus off that I'd learned anything at all. It felt strange, almost like I was becoming a version of him, engineering my own quiet structure while smiling across the dinner table every night. But I told myself the difference mattered. I wasn't hiding money to escape accountability. I was protecting myself from a man who had already decided, apparently years ago, that accountability wasn't something he owed me. Marcus noticed nothing. That was perhaps the strangest part of those weeks. How easily I moved through our life together, attentive, affectionate, even while building a case against him behind a smile that had become second nature. He complimented me on a new garden design I'd completed for a client. He brought home flowers one Thursday for no particular reason, the kind of gesture that used to mean something and now felt like a data point. Another piece of a performance I was only now learning to see clearly. Elena checked in with me twice that week, mostly logistics, signatures needed, documents to gather, small legal mechanisms she was quietly putting into place to freeze certain shared assets from further movement without either of us technically knowing the freeze had occurred. James, meanwhile, had gone quiet for several days, deep in the financial trail, tracing where exactly all the money had gone once it left Crescent Build Partners. Then on a Wednesday evening while Marcus was out, predictably, at what he told me was a late client dinner, James called. "Claire," he said, and something in his voice made me sit down before I even realized I was doing it. "I found the full picture. The hotel on Ridgeview is nearly complete. They're scheduled to open in 4 months. And Victoria Hale isn't just the co-owner. She's listed as the managing partner on the operating agreement. Your husband's name appears nowhere on any of the public-facing documents. It's all structured through intermediary holding companies. On paper, this hotel looks like it belongs entirely to Victoria." He paused, "which means that when it starts generating revenue, none of that income will appear on any document connected to Marcus, or to you. It will all flow through Crescent Build Partners and into accounts that a spouse would have no legal visibility into during a divorce proceeding unless they already knew to look for them." I closed my eyes. "He's been planning this for years." "It appears that way," James said quietly. "The first LLC was registered 4 years ago. The Ridgeview property was purchased 3 years ago. The condo was purchased 4 years ago. This isn't a recent development. This is a long-term exit strategy." I thanked him and hung up. I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The house silent around me. The same kitchen where Marcus and I had cooked dinner together for 17 years. The same kitchen where we'd argued about budgets and celebrated promotions. And once, early in our marriage, stayed up until 3 in the morning painting the cabinets because we couldn't afford to replace them. And we'd laughed so hard at our own incompetence that we'd almost forgotten why we were doing it. Some of it had been real. I believe that. Some of the love, some of the laughter, some of the 17 years. But alongside it, running beneath it like an underground stream, had been this: the quiet, patient construction of a life designed to leave me behind. The next morning, I sat across from Elena and James in that same clean office with the river view, and James laid out a series of printed pages across the table, each one a piece of a financial trail he'd spent the better part of 3 weeks reconstructing. "The money from Marcus's separate accounts doesn't sit still," he explained, tracing a line across one of the pages with his finger. "It moves through 3 different shell companies, all registered to Victoria Hale, all looking on paper like legitimate consulting or development fees. From there, it gets invested. The hotel is the largest asset, but there's also the condo, the vacation rental, and what appears to be a commercial lot near the airport purchased 6 months ago. All of them structured through different LLCs with different registered agents, all of them tracing back to the same funding source." He slid a final document across the table, a property record for the Ridgeview Road Hotel. The listed owner was Crescent Build Partners. The listed managing partner was Victoria Hale. The total construction cost to date, $815,000. The projected annual revenue once operational, between $400,000 and $600,000. "He's not just having an affair," Elena said quietly, watching my face as she spoke. "He's building an entire second financial life, funded quietly out of accounts you don't have visibility into, structured through a woman who has apparently helped other people move money before under murkier circumstances. This is deliberate, Claire. This isn't a man who got emotionally involved and lost his head. This is a man who's been executing a plan for at least 4 years." I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the property record, the shell company names, the careful architecture of it all, and something shifted in me then. Not sadness exactly, though the sadness was still there, buried somewhere beneath the surface. What rose up instead was a strange, clarifying kind of clarity. I finally understood the shape of what I'd been looking at for weeks. Victoria wasn't the point. She never had been. She was infrastructure. A means of building and holding assets in ways that would look, to any casual observer, like unrelated business activity rather than a husband quietly redirecting marital wealth before an exit he'd been planning. Since before I ever walked into Whitmore Hardware and met a woman named Rosa, who decided the truth mattered more than staying quiet. Everything Marcus had built, I realized, depended entirely on one condition: that I never asked a single question. "What matters legally," Elena said, "is intent. Proving the affair might get you a sympathetic judge, but proving that he's been deliberately moving marital assets outside the marriage, structuring shell companies to conceal ownership, and building a revenue-generating business designed to benefit him after a divorce he never disclosed he was planning. That's what protects your financial future. That's what we need to be airtight." Over the following days, I worked with Elena to file what she called protective motions, quiet legal mechanisms that would freeze certain accounts from further movement effective the moment they were filed, without requiring Marcus's immediate knowledge or consent. It felt strange, almost surreal, signing documents that would legally intervene in my own marriage, while Marcus sat 2 rooms away in his home office, humming along to something on the radio, utterly unaware that the walls around his careful structure were quietly closing in. I also asked James to help me gather everything into a single organized file. Bank statements, property records, the LLC ownership documents, the transfers histories, the building permits, the projected revenue statements, all of it arranged chronologically, undeniable, complete. Elena called it building a record. I privately thought of it as building the truth laid out in a form no one could argue with, no one could talk their way around. At home, life continued in its strange doubled rhythm. Marcus remained affectionate, relaxed, entirely himself, the version of himself I'd fallen in love with 17 years earlier. Charming and warm and endlessly reassuring. He helped me carry groceries in from the car. He asked about my landscape design clients with what seemed like genuine interest. One evening, he pulled me close on the couch during a movie neither of us were really watching, and told me quietly that he was grateful for me, for us, for how steady things had always been between us. I let him hold me. I didn't pull away. Some nights I wondered if that made me dishonest too, allowing him to believe nothing had changed while I quietly assembled the evidence of everything that had. But I told myself there was a difference between deception built to protect yourself and deception built to exploit someone who trusted you. I was doing the former. Marcus, for years now, had been doing the latter. By the end of that week, Elena called with an idea that stopped me mid-step in my kitchen. I think it's time, she said, to bring everyone into the same room. Not a courtroom. Not yet. Somewhere private, somewhere controlled, where we can lay everything out at once. Marcus, Victoria, the documentation, all of it. Sometimes the most effective thing isn't illegal filing. It's simply forcing the truth into a room no one can escape. I asked her when. Whenever you're ready, she said. But Claire, once we do this, there's no going back to pretending. You need to be sure. I looked around my kitchen. The one Marcus and I had renovated together 10 years earlier. The one where he'd once helped me pick out cabinet hardware, laughing about how ridiculous it was that two grown adults could spend an hour debating brushed nickel versus oil-rubbed bronze. Nothing about that memory felt like a lie. And that, I realized, was the strangest part of all of this. Some of it had probably been real, and some of it, apparently, had been architecture all along. I'm ready, I told her. Elena arranged everything. She rented a small private conference room in a business center downtown, the kind of neutral, unremarkable space that could belong to anyone and meant nothing to either Marcus or Victoria. Glass walls facing a quiet hallway. A long table with 8 chairs. A generic landscape print on the wall that no one would end up looking at. I chose it deliberately. Nothing about it whispered home or marriage or 17 years of shared history. It was simply a room, and rooms don't take sides. I invited Marcus myself, calling him on a Tuesday, and telling him I needed to discuss something important about our finances, something that couldn't wait for a casual conversation at home. He sounded mildly curious, maybe a little concerned, but not alarmed, the tone of a man who believed right up until the moment he didn't, that he still had control of the narrative. Elena separately arranged for Victoria to be invited under the pretense of a business matter related to Crescent Build Partners' tax filings. Something vague enough not to raise suspicion, but official enough to guarantee her attendance. Neither of them knew the other had been asked to appear. That detail mattered more than almost anything else in the plan. Elena had been firm about it from the beginning. People tell the truth when they're caught off guard in front of the one person they were most trying to keep from finding out. I arrived first, 40 minutes early. I arranged the documents across the table myself. Bank transfer records, the Crescent Build Partners ownership filing, the Ridgeview Road property records, the building permits, the projected revenue statements. James's just carefully constructed timeline connecting every dollar from its origin to its final resting place. I laid them out in order, left to right, a visual trail that told the whole story without a single word needing to be spoken. My hands were steady. I remember being almost surprised by that. Marcus arrived next, glancing at the folders spread across the table, with a flicker of confusion that hadn't yet turned into alarm. "What's all this?" he asked, settling into a chair across from me, loosening his tie slightly. The posture of a man expecting a conversation about retirement accounts, not a reckoning. I didn't answer right away. I was watching the door. Victoria walked in 4 minutes later, expecting, I imagined, some kind of straightforward meeting about tax documentation. She stopped mid-step just inside the doorway when she saw Marcus already seated at the table. For a moment, neither of them moved. I watched something pass between them, not quite panic, but the visible recalibration of two people realizing in the same instant that whatever careful architecture they'd built had just been exposed to daylight. The silence in that room stretched longer than I expected. I let it. Elena had told me not to rush it, that silence does work confrontation never can, and she was right. I watched Marcus's eyes move from Victoria to the documents on the table and back again, watched the calculation happening behind his expression as he tried to determine exactly how much I knew. "Please sit," I finally said to Victoria, my voice even, almost gentle. She sat. I didn't raise my voice once during what followed. I had promised myself that, and Elena had reinforced it. No shouting, no accusations flung across the table. Nothing that could later be characterized as an emotional outburst rather than a legitimate presentation of facts. I simply began walking them through the documents, one at a time, in the same order James had laid them out for me weeks earlier. The transfer history from Marcus's separate accounts to Crescent Build Partners dating back 4 years. The ownership filing naming Victoria as managing partner. The Ridgeview Road property record, the hotel purchased 3 years prior, with funds traced directly back through the same chain. The condo downtown, the vacation rental, the commercial lot near the airport. Marcus tried at first to reframe it. "This is a legitimate investment," he said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence I imagine he used with nervous clients. "Crescent Build is a development company Victoria and I started together. There's nothing illegal about investing in real estate. I was going to tell you about all of this once the hotel was closer to opening. There's nothing illegal about investing in real estate," I agreed calmly. "There's something very illegal, or at the very least very actionable, about systematically transferring marital assets into shell entities designed to keep them outside the reach of your wife, in preparation for a divorce you never once mentioned to me, while building a revenue-generating business whose income would be invisible to any court dividing assets." His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Beside him, Victoria had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the property record spread across the table, and I understood, watching her face, that perhaps even she hadn't fully grasped how directly her name had been tied to the trail. That's when Elena entered, precisely on cue, followed a moment later by James, both of them carrying additional folders, both of them settling into the 2 remaining chairs at the table with the calm efficiency of professionals who had done this before. Marcus's expression shifted again, the color draining slightly from his face as he registered exactly what this room actually was. Not a conversation, a presentation. A case already built, already complete, waiting only for this exact moment to be laid in front of him. "Mr. Donovan," Elena said, her tone crisp and entirely professional. "Everything in front of you has already been reviewed by forensic accounting. We have 4 years of documented transfers, property records, corporate filings, and building permits, establishing a clear pattern of asset concealment and dissipation. I want to be direct with you. This isn't a negotiation about whether these documents exist. It's a conversation about what happens next." Marcus looked at me, then really looked at me in a way he hadn't in weeks, maybe months. I watched something crumble behind his eyes. Not quite guilt, not yet, but the specific panic of a man realizing that the woman across the table had spent weeks building an entire case while he'd been congratulating himself on how smoothly everything was going. "Claire," he started, "I can explain everything. Victoria and I, we never meant for you to find out this way. We were going to sit down with you once the hotel was generating revenue and bring you into the partnership. I swear to you, that was always the plan." I looked at him, this man I'd loved for 17 years, this man whose face I'd woken up next to thousands of times, and I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not even grief, not in that moment. Just the quiet, final understanding that the person I'd believed I was married to, and the person sitting across from me were not the same man, and had not been for a very long time. "You registered the first LLC 4 years ago," I said quietly. "You bought the Ridgeview property 3 years ago. The condo was purchased 4 years ago. You've had hundreds of opportunities to tell me. You chose, every single time, not to. That's not a plan to include me. That's a plan to make sure I never knew." He had no answer for that. Alina reached into her bag and withdrew one final envelope, sealed, official-looking, and slid it slowly across the table until it stopped directly in front of Marcus. He stared at it for a long moment before reaching for it, his hands for the first time all evening visibly unsteady. He opened it. His face went completely pale. Inside the envelope were 3 documents, and I watched Marcus's eyes move across each one, his expression shifting with every page he turned. The first was a formal asset protection order Elena had already filed, freezing further movement on the accounts James had traced, effective immediately. The second was a financial injunction related specifically to Crescent Build Partners and the properties connected to it, a legal mechanism that would require full disclosure and accounting of every dollar that had passed through those channels over the past 4 years. The third was our divorce petition, already drafted, already signed on my end, waiting only for the date to be filled in. Marcus set the papers down slowly, his hands still not quite steady, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. I watched him understand in real time that this wasn't the beginning of a conversation. It was the end of one that had actually started weeks earlier, without him ever knowing it was happening. "You've already," he started, then stopped, looking at Elena, at James, at the folders still spread across the table. "This is already filed. Some of it," Elena said evenly. "The rest will be, depending on how the next conversation goes." Marcus looked at me again, and I could see him searching for something to say, some version of events that might soften what was so plainly laid out in front of him. "I was going to explain everything," he finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence it had carried when he first walked into the room. I just needed more time. I was going to tell you, Claire. I swear I was. I believed in that moment that some part of him actually thought that was true. That somewhere in his mind he had a version of the story where he eventually sat me down and confessed everything gently, on his own terms, at a moment of his choosing. But that version required my ignorance to last exactly as long as he needed it to, and not one day longer. It required me to keep trusting him right up until he decided I no longer needed to. You didn't build a future for us, I said quietly. And I remember how calm my own voice sounded, how strange that calm felt given everything underneath it. You built one that only worked if I never discovered it. Victoria hadn't spoken through any of this. She sat very still, her eyes moving between the documents and Marcus's face. And when I finally looked at her directly, she looked away first. She gathered her bag a moment later, stood and left the room without a single word. Not an apology, not a denial, nothing. I think in a strange way, that told me everything I needed to know about how much of this had genuinely been about affection, and how much had simply been business she'd gotten too comfortable conducting. Marcus stayed a while longer, saying things I mostly don't remember now. Apologies that blurred together into a kind of background noise. What I do remember is the moment he finally understood that nothing he said in that room was going to change anything, because the decisions had already been made weeks earlier, quietly, while he was busy believing he still held all the control. He left eventually, the envelope still on the table, its contents no longer something he could pretend not to have seen. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way I once imagined they might be, back when I first started keeping that leather journal. There was no explosive confrontation beyond that conference room. No public scene, no screaming. Just paperwork and lawyers and the slow, unglamorous process of untangling 17 years of a shared life into two separate ones. James's documentation held up exactly as Elena had promised it would. The house, which we had renovated together, which held 10 years of memories, including an hour spent debating cabinet hardware, remained mine. The assets I had protected in those quiet weeks before the meeting stayed intact. The hotel, the condo, the vacation rental, all of them became part of the settlement negotiations, their existence no longer a secret that could be used against me. I didn't seek revenge. Not really, though I understand why some people might expect that ending from a story like this one. I didn't need Marcus humiliated publicly or punished beyond what the facts themselves demanded. What I wanted, in the end, was simply what was mine, protected and secure, and the truth laid out clearly enough that no one, including Marcus himself, could pretend it had been anything other than what it was. My grandfather left me a piece of land when he died, 5 acres out near the foothills, a place I'd always talked about turning into something but never quite found the time for, while I was busy building a life around someone else's plans. That spring, I broke ground on the native plant nursery I'd been dreaming about since I was a girl, following him through his gardens. Learning the names of every flower and shrub and tree he pointed to with his weathered hands, I called it Root and Branch. It felt strange at first, signing supplier contracts and business licenses under only my own name. But the strangeness faded faster than I expected. There's a particular kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from finally understanding exactly where you stand. My grandfather used to say that the healthiest gardens are the ones where you know what's in the soil before you plant anything. I think in the end, that's what those weeks of silence and documentation gave me. Not revenge. Just the truth of what was in the soil, and the clarity to decide what I wanted to grow in it next. Some nights when I let myself think about it, I realized that betrayal isn't always a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it's not a lie spoken once and regretted. Sometimes it's years spent quietly building a life that was never meant to include you. One small transfer, one careful meeting, one load of cedar shingles at a time, until one day, a stranger has to be the one to tell you the truth about your own marriage. A few months ago, I drove past that same hardware store, on Route 12, the one with the wooden floors and the garden center, and the smell of sawdust that always reminded me of my grandfather. I hadn't been back since that Sunday. I slowed down without quite meaning to, looking at the entrance, remembering Rosa's careful voice, the way she'd chosen to tell me something that wasn't her responsibility to tell, simply because she thought I deserved to know. I smiled. Not because I won anything exactly, but because one ordinary Sunday, a woman with 19 years behind that red vest decided that telling the truth mattered more than staying quiet. And that single choice gave me back my life. If you've made it this far with me, thank you for staying until the end. I pinned a question in the comments. If you discovered your partner had been building an entire second life, not just an affair, but a complete financial and professional future designed without you in it, where would you draw the line between forgiveness and self-protection? Go to that pinned comment and tell me your honest thoughts. I want to know where you stand, and if this story reminded you of a woman who had to learn the hard way that trust is not the same thing as truth, stay close to she chose herself. Every voice here helps another woman believe that she can choose herself too, even when it's the hardest choice she's ever had to make.